You're listening to an Airwave Media Podcast.
This episode is brought to you by Redfin. You're listening to a podcast, which means you're probably multitasking. Maybe even scrolling home listings on Redfin, saving homes without expecting to get them. But Redfin isn't just built for endless browsing. It's built to help you find and own a home. With agents who close twice as many deals, when you find the one, you've got a real shot at getting it. Get started at redfin.com. Own the dream.
Grown-ups, if there's a child in your life who is interested in, curious about, or fascinated by people and places from history, then my podcast, The Past and the Curious, might just be a hit in your home. From the invention of microscopes to world-traveling dogs to fashions of the 1890s, gold rush ghost towns, and audiences going wild for walking competitions, we've got a little bit of it all. Hosted by children's author and museum educator Mick Sullivan, that's me, the show is fun, funny, engaging, honest, and beloved by kids and parents alike. Find The Past and the Curious at all the usual podcast places.
This episode is brought to you by our Patreon members. Thank you so much.
Join our Patreon for extra episodes, interviews, extra content, and to help support the podcast and help us continue to do the work we do.
Go to patreon.com/ancienthistoryfangirl to learn more.
Yes, they all die in 14. Like, shit gets bad.
I'm Jenny Williamson.
And I'm Jen McMenemy.
And this is Ancient History Fangirl, and we are so thrilled to welcome to the podcast today historical fiction author Tana Rebellis, author of the Exile Duology about famous Julio-Claudian exiles, Julia the Elder and Julia the Younger, daughter and granddaughter of the Emperor Augustus, among other exiles. Welcome, Tana.
Thank you so much for having me. Very excited to be here. Love your guys' podcast, so...
Aw, thanks.
Thank you. We're so excited to have you here. I mean, the Julio-Claudians are like my tea. They're my favorite thing to talk about of all time.
You know, mine too, of all the different dynasties. I think the Julio-Claudians have always been the most interesting to me, and I probably have to blame that on HBO Rome. I was in high school, I think, and was just fascinated by it, went to college, had thought I was going to major in biology, but needed to do a language requirement and a history class. So I enrolled in some classics department stuff and then immediately was like, this is what I'm going to study.
Oh, yeah. It's such a soap opera. Like, there's everything in this family. The drama is just so extreme and wild, and I love it.
I also love HBO's Rome. I've rewatched it several times. We did a whole series on Julius Caesar and then going into Mark Antony and Cleopatra for the podcast. So I kind of fell in love with them that way, but I already was in love with them through various other things. Jen, of course, did our Ancient World Stark family series, which is all about Agrippina, the Agrippinas.
The Agrippinas, the Caligulas, the children. So much exile.
Yeah. So this is actually tying into my first question. I used Julia the Elder as kind of one of my inspirations for the Julia of my novel, which is a romance novel about Alaric of the Visigoths falling in love with a wayward Roman princess that I made up. And she's kind of got a Julia the Elder-like part of her personality where she's very rebellious. So I'm really excited to talk about her and, of course, Julia the Younger and everyone else who wound up on an island in the Julio-Claudian reign. But I did want to get to what you've already kind of alluded to first, which is that in addition to being a historical fiction author, you're a classic scholar who wrote your senior thesis on the phenomenon of Julio-Claudian exile. So what drew you to this topic in particular?
So I think it started probably my sophomore year. I read a passage in Suetonius, probably for a Latin class, about how Augustus did not allow his daughter and granddaughter to be put in his mausoleum. And I was like, okay, that's interesting. And I was also taking a class at the same time on Roman death, and we were looking at the mausoleum of Augustus. And so I kind of had the thought, well, if they weren't allowed in the mausoleum, like why and what happened to them instead? And so I just started kind of digging into who they were, what happened, and why they were not allowed in the mausoleum, and what would have happened instead. And it just sort of took me down this path of exile, specifically island exile, and the treatment of women at the time, as well as just funerary treatment in general. And then it just kind of spiraled from there. So I did a lot of independent research my junior year, just specifically on funerary practices. And then my senior year, I wrote my undergraduate dissertation on Julio-Claudian island exile, which wound up being very, very long. I think our department requirement is you have to have like a 50-page thesis. I think mine was about 200 pages. And I wound up winning the senior thesis prize for best senior thesis at the Princeton University Department of Classics. So that was very, very gratifying because that kind of just consumed my senior year, but I loved it.
And yeah, it's such a fascinating topic. And I don't know, actually, could you remind me of this? Was Julio-Claudian exile like its own phenomenon? Like, was exile kind of a thing that all the Roman emperors did, or was this very specifically Julio-Claudian?
So I mostly focused on the Julio-Claudians, but they did sort of set a new bar for exile. Previously, if people were exiled, generally they just had to leave Rome or go further and further out. And they could usually withdraw to some sort of countryside villa or some territory, and they just kind of kept to themselves. And as long as they did that, they were fine. But you start seeing with Augustus that he was very concerned about keeping closer tabs on his family members. So what better place to do that than a small island? You can stick someone out there. And there were villas out here usually, so it wasn't like they were camping. But, easy places to keep tabs on someone, to keep them controlled, presumably send guards out with them. And so it was much more of a closer watch than in previous years, and specifically for family members, people who were important and who could be potentially used against the emperor. I think as you go through history, you do start to see that typically they just start killing people more often. Usually the women were sent to islands. They were there sometimes for years, decades. But there were examples of men such as Agrippa Postumus, Nero and Drusus Caesar, who were either imprisoned or sent to an island as well, but typically killed much quicker. Later on, I feel like it tended to just be executions more quickly.
Yeah, this was I think one of the things to remember about Augustus in general is he is the first emperor. So Julius Caesar wasn't an emperor, even though sometimes it's easy to forget that. He was a dictator for life who was assassinated. But when you get to Augustus, he's actually creating the empire and, really transitioning the Roman Republic fully into an empire under control of one person. And he had a lot of hangups about how that person should behave and that they were just like the first citizen, not really an emperor, but he was doing all this creepy emperor stuff. And I think, that's part of why he did so much exile, because a lot of times he'd seen what happened when a populist like a Mark Antony or a Julius Caesar could rally people behind them. So I think some of that exile was to take those people away from the public eye and maybe diminish their personality before he murdered them. But I didn't write the dissertation on this. Am I sort of right?
Yeah. If you look at the reasons given for exile, specifically when it comes to women, it's usually they're a bunch of sluts. Am I allowed to say that?
Well, yeah. He had a real problem with women's sexual agency.
This was a question I was actually going to ask you, was that if I happened to be a prominent member of society during this time, or a member of the Julio-Claudian family perhaps, and I really wanted to not be exiled to a deserted island, what would you recommend that I do or not do? And it is just not be slutty, or is there something more to it?
So I feel like generally that was a mask for other sort of maneuverings. Like Julia the Elder always gets the short end of the stick. Everyone just says, oh, she had so many lovers and she was having sex in the forum. And I mean, okay, I'm sure maybe she did have lovers or whatever, but I honestly do feel that a lot of these women were of more of a concern because politically they were important. Unfortunately for Augustus, pretty much all of the men in his family line that he wanted to become his heirs died off, suspiciously or otherwise. And so when you start looking at the Julio-Claudian dynasty, it's important who the women are because they're the mothers and the sisters of the emperor. So that did matter. I think it's a mistake to say that women, just because we don't see them as much in the historical record, were completely powerless. I think they were involved in different political maneuverings. It was important who they were talking to if they were plotting. But again, looking at the time period, if you're Augustus, you don't want to say that your daughter is politically powerful. That's not her role. She's a woman who should be married to who he tells her to, have kids, and just be quiet and support him. So an easy sort of out historically for women that we've seen, I mean, for thousands of years, is they're witches or they're sleeping with people who they shouldn't, but you very rarely see acknowledgement of any sort of political influence. But that does not mean that they did not have any political power.
Yeah, because women didn't have that sort of in front of the camera power, like everything was behind the scenes. My favorite example comes from Emma Southon's book, Agrippina, about how in Nero's early reign, Agrippina wasn't allowed to sit in on the actual business going on. So she was sitting behind a curtain, and whenever Nero would make a decision, she'd give a little cough to sort of influence him in the way she wanted things to go. Obviously, it did not go great for her, but she is sort of towards the end of a long line of very strong Julio-Claudian women who really played this cat and mouse game with exile or murder.
Yeah, I definitely wanted to go more the root of that as well, just strong women in my book. So you'll see that Julia the Elder, who has sort of secondary chapters in the first book, I have her as a very powerful, somewhat conniving, and not always particularly likable character, to be honest, which I was fine with because I feel like she probably would not be super likable to a modern day person or woman. But I wanted her to have agency and to show that she was working behind the scenes to make things happen. Julia the Younger, who is the protagonist of the book, I do have as a little bit more of a politically innocent character, where I don't have her heavily involved in a lot of plotting. And I sort of chose to go that route with her because she was in exile for decades. The name The Longest Exile comes from the fact that she was in exile the longest of any Julio-Claudian woman. And I do not believe that would have been the case, that she would have been allowed to keep living had she been too much of a political player. So for her, I decided we're going to go with more of a story of just she's kind of gotten sucked up into a lot of other things, and there's a lot of other people around her who are trying to pull her into different plots.
This kind of ties into that question that I had about what can you do to avoid being exiled to an island. And the sense that I'm getting is that you kind of can't avoid it, because you could be a woman who is just sort of tangentially related to some plotting, and people are plotting around you and your name is associated with it because that's your husband or your family member or whatever. So you get exiled because you're a danger too. Is that accurate?
Yeah, that's very much my sense of everything as well, is that it's not always so much what you do, but it's who you are. And so unfortunately, just being born into that family or marrying into it, you are at risk. Your children are at risk. In the second book of the duology, I look at Julia the Younger's legitimate child, Aemilia Lepida, who was left behind in Rome. And without spoiling too much in that book, unfortunately for her, her own children, so the grandchildren of Julia the Younger, almost all meet very unfortunate fates. And it's largely just because of their relation to Augustus and the family. It's pretty easy at the time, without great due process, to invent some charges against people and axe them. So,
is that Messalena's mother, or am I on the wrong side of the family?
Wrong side of the family.
It's the other one with Sejanus, isn't it?
Yeah, so she was, the second book, she's alive at the time of Sejanus. And so that's sort of the backdrop in the second book, is all of his plotting and just looking at what Julia the Younger's daughter would have been doing in Rome with her parents out of the picture.
Hello everyone, Stakuyi here.
And I'm Gabby.
And we are the hosts of History of Everything, a podcast which you can probably guess by the name is, well, it's about everything. Do you want to know why people thought potatoes were evil and would give you syphilis? Are you curious about all the stories of the terrible and stupid ways that people have kicked the bucket over the years? Do you want to hear tales about all of the different badasses of history and the lives that they had brought to life? Well, if so, then look no further. History of Everything is just the right podcast for you. It's available on Spotify, Pandora, and anywhere else that you get your podcast from. Join us for some fun and just see how weird and wacky history can be.
Hello everyone, my name is Wesley Livesey from the History of the Second World War podcast. My podcast is a mostly chronological retelling of the Second World War, and I hope you will join me on a journey through the most cataclysmic conflict in human history, as we try to answer the questions of not just what and where, but how and why. Join me on a journey not just through the famous campaigns, battles, and events, but also on a trip around the globe as we broaden the scope of Second World War history beyond the well-known battlefields of Europe and the Pacific. During weekly episodes, I seek to provide new insight for longtime students of the war, while also being a great jumping-on point for anyone seeking a deeper understanding of the Second World War. This podcast has made it to the invasion of Poland in 1939, and start listening now to find out how the world would find itself embroiled in its second worldwide conflict in just 20 years. You can find History of the Second World War on all major podcast platforms or at historyofthesecondworldwar.com.
Throughout history, royals across the world were notorious for incest. They married their own relatives in order to consolidate power and keep their blood blue. But they were oblivious to the havoc all this inbreeding was having on the health of their offspring. From Egyptian pharaohs marrying their own sisters to the Habsburgs' notoriously oversized lower jaws. I explore the most shocking incestuous relationships and tragically inbred individuals in royal history. And that's just episode 1. On the History Tea Time podcast, I profile remarkable queens and LGBTQ+ royals, explore royal family trees, and delve into women's medical history and other fascinating topics. I'm Lindsay Holiday, and I'm spilling the tea on history. Join me every Tuesday for new episodes of the History Tea Time podcast, wherever fine podcasts are enjoyed.
Okay, so what could I expect if I was exiled to a remote island during the Julio-Claudian period? Like, what was life on these islands like?
So I was actually fortunate enough to get funding to go visit some of these islands as part of my research. And I think probably my favorite exile island is Pandateria, which is modern day Ventotene. Most of them are on the Mediterranean side. Julia the Younger was sent to the Adriatic side, which is unique. But basically, most of these islands are not super large. There's usually one or a handful of very nice villas that were imperial estates, basically. And when you look at textual evidence as well, for example, for Julia the Elder, it was said that Augustus did not allow his daughter to have wine. She wasn't allowed to have male visitors. So what you can infer from that is, okay, well, who's going to be there enforcing it? There must have been guards, slaves, people reporting back. And again, as a high profile person like his daughter or granddaughter or grandson in the case of Agrippa Posthumus, he's not going to leave them unguarded. So in some ways, I kind of view it as like being a bird in a gilded cage. You know, it's not like they're starving, but these islands can be pretty windy, probably not super nice and anything in the winter, but probably boring as well for people who are used to living in Rome and having just sort of their every whim answered that's now taken away from them. You do see, in the case of Agrippa Posthumus, he was sent to a much rockier, harder to approach island, probably because as a male, he's a little bit higher profile than his female family members in a way. And what you also see looking at these islands throughout history, they've often been repurposed in later times as islands of exile in the 60s. Mussolini used a couple of them as sort of prisons. Tremeris, which is where Julia the Younger was sent, is actually a group of about 4 islands, and 2 of them are more significant in size. And there's no archaeological remains there. So we know that's where Julia the Younger was sent, but there's no villa remains. I assume it's probably been built over and not discovered. A lot of these islands, the ancient port is now the modern port. So you can kind of see everyone's just kind of moved in. It's been built up over time. But Tremeris was used as sort of like an exile colony for gay people, unfortunately. Under Mussolini, they were just sent hundreds, thousands of them there and kind of just left them to die. Where Agrippa Posthumus was exiled, there was a prison there for quite a long time. And I think at some point they were sending members of the mafia there as well. So it's just interesting that these islands, for the most part, have remained places of exile and imprisonment at other times in history. Although I will say Ventotene, ancient Pandateria, is now a very nice touristy island, and so is Tremeris as well. So,
did you visit the villa on Pandateria? What was it like?
I did, yes. It was amazing. So there's the main villa, which is where Julia was, and some kind of other smaller remains. There's an old necropolis, underground water tanks and tunnels, and there's a little museum as well. So if you ever get the chance to go, it's amazing. But there's like one lady who runs everything. You know, she has the keys to all the sites and she does the mowing. I don't think there's a massive amount of funding to keep all of this, but like a lot of the marble from the villa has been repurposed in the village. You can see it in people's balconies. And it's just, I don't know, it's amazing to really get the sense of what it would have been like to live there. Very beautiful, but very lonely. You're basically in a palace by yourself. I mean, they had a full bath complex. It was beautiful. There's still some paintings that remain.
It's wild that it would have been that luxurious, but still a prison.
Yeah, that really stuck out to me as well. I don't know. I think it would very quickly go from being a nice little, retreat to you're trapped there for years and years and years. And in the elder Julia's case, when she was on the island again, she wasn't allowed to have wine or anything like that. So I'm sure that was probably pretty boring for her. But she did get moved back to the mainland eventually, and I think had a little bit more freedom.
It must be hard too. I mean, you couldn't have friends visit. Like, you were very much under the watchful eye of your captor back in Rome, regardless of like what you did or wanted to do. Like, it can be as luxurious as you want, but it's still a cage. And from what I remember, a lot of times they had to have like food and supplies sent into them at this time period. I'm sure they must have had gardens and stuff, but I know like someone, I don't remember when, like starved to death because the food just stopped coming.
Well, the starving to death is not always that the food stopped coming. That was a favored form of execution for women. Generally, the Romans, at least at the time period, didn't like to just straight up go and stab someone who is female. The men, it was okay to execute them.
Unless they were poor Drusus.
But even in Republican times, the women, if you did something bad enough, your family would often just lock you in a room and starve you to death. So that was unfortunately a fairly common way to just axe women. I would probably rather just be outright killed, to be honest, than starved to death.
Yeah, I'd rather be outright axed.
Oh, yeah. So this is a thing that just ordinary families did to wayward women and their family?
I wouldn't say necessarily ordinary families, but I would say upper class families, yes. That was a fairly common way. But it did happen. And you see it with the Julio-Claudians as well, that was just a way of killing women. And it, in a weird way, it sort of gave the patriarch of the family a little bit of deniability of saying that you didn't outright kill them, right? If you didn't put the sword to them, they starved to death. And it's sort of like everyone knew, but I think it's a weird way of kind of getting around outright killing someone.
That's a very thin pretext. I mean,
yeah. I mean, and similar to like when they would tell people, well, you have to commit suicide now. So in a way, it's like, okay, well, we didn't execute you, but if you don't commit suicide, we will. So people were told that they had to commit suicide and they would do it. And part of that was if people were executed, sometimes their belongings could be taken, their families would suffer. So by complying and committing suicide or walling up and starving to death your troublesome woman, you could maybe spare the rest of your family a bad fate as well.
Jenny, it's the Vestal Virgin or being buried alive or the child being exposed on a mountaintop, right? Like, we know what's going to happen to that person, but we're just like, well, maybe the gods intervene, probably not, but let's move on.
So we've covered Augustus quite a bit, mainly in his early iteration as the very punchable Octavian, in our Julius Caesar series and later work on Mark Antony and Cleopatra. But we are where your first book in your duology, The Longest Exile, starts. We're later in Augustus's reign now. Could you set the scene for us? Where are we in Augustus's rule at the opening of your duology, and what kind of ruler was he by now? And what was he doing specifically that resulted in the rebellion of his female family members?
So we're in 8 CE. The book starts in Rome, and Augustus is a little bit older. I don't think it's ruining anything to say that he passes away in 14. So he's in the twilight years of his reign. And he's very much trying to figure out, how does the empire that he's established continue? Who does he make his heir? And one of the candidates is Tiberius, who is the son of his wife Livia, so his stepson, who he actually had married to his daughter, the elder Julia. Did not work out. They hated each other. Germanicus is around still, is a candidate, but again, not ruining too much. If you know your ancient history, which you probably do looking at this podcast, things just keep not working out for him. And so when we start in 8 CE, that's sort of what's happening, is he's trying to kind of figure that out. The younger Julia, her husband has been executed for treason of some sort. I go along the route of saying that he was involved in some sort of plot with Agrippa Posthumus and possibly the elder Julia. But we don't know quite as much about that, again, because it's not a good look to have everyone know that some people were almost successful overthrowing you. So Julia, the younger, at the beginning of the book, is sent to an island because she is pregnant with her lover's child. Again, her husband's been executed for treason already, and the math does not add up. Historically, we don't know for sure when her husband was executed. It was sometime during the reign of Augustus. But during my research, my advisor and I kind of figured he must have been dead before the time that she was exiled, just based on looking at when Agrippa Posthumus was exiled as well. There has to have been some connection between that. It's too much of a coincidence to say, oh, he was executed and Agrippa was exiled at the same time. And again, if Julia the Younger was pregnant with her husband's child, she would not have been exiled, because even though he was a traitor, he was executed, the child would have been legitimate. It would have been fine to raise. So the fact that she was exiled pregnant, it must have not been her husband. So he must have been dead before 8 CE.
I love listening to historians tell us about that process of working out things like, oh, this was definitely the lover's child because of these different facts, and like parsing out women's stories throughout like the little clues we have, because we don't know so much, because as you said, like it wouldn't have been a great look for Augustus to have all this known. So like, you know, I feel like it's a real forensic job to go into the ancient sources and what we know and find these stories and tease them out. And I just think it's just the most fascinating work.
I mean, what's a lot of fun too is, to some extent with women in history, is we don't always know as much. So there are some things that you can piece together, and it's enough to give you the beginning of a story. And then that's where the historical fiction takes over. I like to be as true as possible to known events, dates, relationships, all of that. So if someone, you know, dies a certain year, I'm not going to keep them alive another year or two because it suits my plot. I feel strongly about that. But it is fun because, like, once Julia gets sent to the island, other than sort of a few other things that are mentioned in history, we don't really know what she was doing all that time. And so just based on being able to create an environment, having the backstory, you're able to go a little bit more wild with the plot there. And hopefully, you know, I hope I did justice to them, these real women who suffered some sort of crazy events in their lives. So
I want to flesh this out a little bit. I'm mainly asking about Augustus's measures that he was taking to get the women of Rome to not be so slutty. You know what I mean? Like, what was he doing that his female family members, Julia the Elder, and then we're going to get into Julia the Younger, what rules was he putting in place that they were rebelling against?
So I believe he had the sort of sumptuary laws, if I'm remembering correctly as well, where women were not supposed to wear basically too much or too fancy jewelry. You know, women were supposed to be married, to have a certain number of children. They were under guardianship. And so until you produced X number of legitimate Roman children, you basically belonged completely to your husband. And so it was not a good look for him when his own daughter, granddaughters, you know, other female relatives were not always married, didn't have enough kids, were going to parties, having affairs. They were supposed to be the leading family and the leading women of Rome. And so if he's expecting that of other families and people, you would think that his own children and grandchildren would be adhering. And unfortunately, they were not.
They were not.
I feel like you could adhere to it, Germanicus and Agrippina the Elder, and it could still all go terribly wrong.
Well, yeah, even Agrippina the Elder, you know, when you look at all the women who were exiled, it winds up happening to her as well. And, you know, again, that might be like a little bit of a spoiler. Yeah. But again, it's sort of an example of it doesn't matter how good she was. And she was beloved by the Roman people, but because of who she was, that was also her downfall. So you can be pretty secure with one emperor, and then he kicks the bucket and you have someone else who comes in and they try and solidify their power. And that's usually by killing off and exiling people who they consider threats to that.
I think that's what I liked about how you chose to depict your Julia here, because like you said, to a modern audience, she might not be very likable in some places. And that's deliberate because like the women who hung around, who had seats at the table with a little bit of power, they wouldn't have been very likable to us as modern people. They would have had to do a lot of things that we would be like, oh, do you really want to do that? Because in order to stay alive and to keep their children alive with the constantly shifting political landscape, it was a real Shark Tank.
I really disagree with the idea that our fictional women that we write about has to be likable.
And I agree with that as well. And originally, when I was sending this book out to some publishers, that was some sort of feedback I got, that they couldn't always like fully connect with the characters, or they didn't find them always super likable. And I kind of stood firm on that, and that I've never felt like we would always fully understand or like people of the past. And one of my sort of pet peeves in historical fiction is 21st century type characters set in the past, very feminist, or, and it's a hard line to walk, because you want people to like the characters and relate to some extent. But I also think it's important in historical fiction to convey things pretty accurately. And like you said, Jen, you're not going to like a lot of these women. You're not going to like a lot of the men either, because it was a different time period. It was very cutthroat. It was kill or be killed, which I think many people in the 21st century, you're not going to be able to identify with that.
Yeah. I mean, I've talked about it many times. I did the main research on our Germanicus arc, and really the character I could not ever understand was Agrippina the Younger. I was like, I loved Agrippina the Elder. And really my views on both of them swapped as I was doing the research, because I was like, yeah, I love Agrippina the Elder. I love everything you do, but also like maybe this wasn't the right way to go about trying to solidify your power base. And then you get to the Younger, who marries her uncle, and there's all the stuff with Nero and all the things that are going on. I'm not going to like spoil too much, but it's all in the series. And I really struggled with her because I didn't find her to be a very likable person based on how I grew up and preconceived notions. And the more I dug into the research, I'm like, sure, if she did this stuff now, we'd be like, wow. But actually what she did to survive and how that time period worked, I felt like I don't have to like her, but I respect the game she played. And what happened throughout her lifetime was just fascinating. And I think like that's a thing that good historians and good historical fiction does, right? It makes you look at someone who'd be like, oh, I don't know as a modern reader, like how I feel about this. And by the end, you're like, fuck yeah, she did the right thing, or the only thing she could do, even if it's weird.
Yeah, I mean, it's more interesting to me if it's not necessarily relatable, but you look at things that some of these women did, and it's just like you have to imagine how desperate they must have been to be in that position.
It's the Paradise Podcast.
I am your host, Ryan Michelle Bethay, with my husband, Sterling.
What's up?
Join us here on Hulu and Hulu on Disney Plus, where we'll discuss each episode with the cast and crew of Paradise. I'll be getting all the secrets from Dan Fogelman, James Marsden, Shailene Woodley, Julianne Nicholson, and Sterling Kelby-Brown. Woo! Paradise, the official podcast, is now streaming.
And stream Paradise on Hulu and Hulu on Disney Plus.
No one hates history, they just haven't found the right teacher yet. Or in this case, a nerdy best friend who loves to tell you all about world history, women's history, and weird history. Hi, I'm TK, the creator of For the Love of History podcast, a place for people who want to learn more but don't know where to start, and history lovers who want to break from the mainstream. From rat trials to warrior women, we cover topics from every country and era. Whether you're a history expert or just starting out, there's a place for you here in the Time Machine. So join me every Friday on your favorite podcast platform and YouTube for a brand new topic. See you there. Bye.
Let's get back to Julia the Elder a little bit, because I'm super fascinated by her. I've always been so interested in her. Julia the Elder was Augustus's only biological child. What do we know about who she was as a person and why she rebelled against her father? And what she's known for, as far as I remember, is mostly sleeping around quite a bit. But was there more to it than that?
Sort of one of those things, again, you have to piece it together. And I I believe she probably did have affairs.
What else was there to do? They were usually married to someone like 20 years older than them.
Who went off to war and wasn't there, you know, a lot of the time. But also, like, Julia the Elder was married off. Like, she was married to someone she liked and then forced to marry someone she hated. And it was just like a lot of moving her around like a chess piece and making her marry different dudes, you know? So, of course, she's going to seize her agency.
She was a chess piece, again, which is very much what I feel like women were used as at the time, unfortunately for them, but again, sort of does show their importance because she was the only surviving biological, legitimate child of Augustus. So much hinged upon her and her children. And so she was married to Marcus Agrippa first, who was much older. That was Augustus's favorite general friend. And she had a lot of children with him, which sort of makes me think that they probably did somewhat get along. I mean, as far as we can tell, it's not like she popped out the bare minimum of kids. Historically, I think they must have at least gotten along to some extent. And so they had 4 surviving children. She sort of, you know, did her duty in that way. And then later on, she's forced to marry Tiberius, who was her stepbrother, basically, who also was forced to divorce a wife that he very much loved to marry Julia instead. And it looks like maybe they kind of tried at first. They did have one child who died very early on or was stillborn, and just wound up hating each other. And so just trying to envision maybe what Julia would have felt like, I think to some extent, she probably would have felt fairly used and just tired of everything, but also would have recognized her own power and value being the sole legitimate child of Augustus, and probably had people whispering in her ear and trying to use her as well.
What was she exiled for?
So officially she was exiled for basically adultery, sleeping around, having affairs. And it was an interesting example when I was looking through the historical record. There was sort of a difference in exile between Augustus acting as emperor in an official sort of political capacity and then acting as the pater familias, which was the head of the family. And if I remember correctly, I think he did technically exile Julia as the pater familias. I think he did go kind of tell the Senate, but at the end of the day, I think he used his role as the patriarch in that, which was sometimes different from what they would do with men. With men, it was more of an official sanction. With women, they often just used their power as the head of the family. And she was exiled in 2 BC to the island of Pandateria, modern Ventotene, and was there until about 6. And then what changed is that basically people died and Augustus had to change sort of his plans again about who was going to succeed. And as part of that, I believe, felt like he wanted to give Julia a little bit more of a chance and moved her to Rhegium, which is sort of on the boot of Italy towards the bottom. So she was still in exile, but back on the mainland, sort of moved a little bit back into favor, would have probably had a little bit more freedom. And one notable thing as well about Julia is that her mother, who was Augustus's ex-wife, Scribonia, accompanied her into exile. She was allowed to do that, which, and I don't want to give Augustus too much credit, but I think it was nice that Scribonia was allowed to go. So Julia did have some companionship in the form of her mother in exile. And as far as we know, Scribonia stayed with her until the end.
See, I have a different take on that. I think allowing her to go is kind of cutting off that entire side of the family from the potential heirs, because all the heirs at this time would have been Julia's children. So now they have sort of no real alliance with their grandmother not being able to have a say or talk about their mother or anything. Now they're very much under the control and thumb of Augustus. But that's me wanting to punch him in the face.
I think it's fair to give Augustus absolutely no credit. I think that's fair.
It is one of those things that's like, oh, is this one of the times Octavia was raising someone else's kids again? Probably.
Was she ever not doing that?
I mean, no, she was always raising someone else's kids and grandkids.
Julia was exiled to Pandateria, as we've discussed, for 5 years. What was the food like? And what would her relationships with her guards be like? This is actually a really interesting thing to me because like there had to have been a power imbalance there, right? Like, because she would have had guards, she would have had slaves, but she was not in the same position she would have been on the mainland in Rome. Like, she was basically their prisoner. So what do we know about her treatment? We know that she was in a very luxurious palace, and she wasn't allowed wine, for one thing. What were some other things about her day-to-day life that we can glean?
Pandateria was sort of a stopping island for different sort of shippers. There are a lot of wrecks off the island. People would come through transporting different goods. There is a port on the island, so I imagine a lot of ships would have come in and dropped supplies. There's not a lot of growing land on the island. It's fairly rocky. They probably would have kept things like chickens. Obviously, fishing would have been a big one, and there was a lot of salt vats. But I imagine a decent amount of food would have had to have been shipped in at least a couple times a year. And because there was an existing port, there's an existing villa and some other structures, it's not like it was completely uninhabited. But again, the texts say that Julia was not allowed to have wine, which was a big one. The Romans drank a lot of wine. That was sort of like a primary drink. And she wasn't allowed to have male visitors. So obviously, I can imagine the guards would have been males, but they would have been making sure that, you know, the sailors on the ships weren't coming up, that there were no other uninvited visitors coming to the island. And I do imagine the food, it's not like she was starving, but it wouldn't have probably been as extravagant as what it was in Rome. And again, definitely a power imbalance in that she is a prisoner, but she's still the daughter of Augustus. So I don't imagine she would have been terribly mistreated. I don't think Augustus, when you look at how he was exiling everyone, Augustus didn't actually kill any of them. You know, he kept them out of the way. He wanted them away from Rome. He wanted them protected from other people who wanted to use them for their own ends and also to keep them from escaping. But he didn't want to actually murder them. And you can infer whether that's just because, you know, they were his family. Maybe there was some sort of, he did kind of like them, but also just didn't want other people to use them. So he did stop short of killing them. And I think he would not have been happy to hear that his daughter was being mistreated by the guards, but it certainly wasn't a cushy vacation. These were villas and islands that they would withdraw to for fun. Where Agrippa Posthumus was sent, there's the remains of a little theater. So they were having entertainment when these places were used as vacation villas. If you look at Capri, where Tiberius was, you know, it was like a nice vacation. They probably had scrolls, they put on plays, they would bring chefs with them, but this was different in that it was exile. It was an imprisonment. It was not a let's have fun for a couple weeks. You know, it was like you are there for years, and that's about it.
Let's talk about Julia the Younger. She was exiled potentially for having an affair, potentially also for plotting, although that's questionable. And she was on a different island from her mother, Triremius, as we mentioned, where she remained in exile for 20 years. And I believe in the history she gives birth in exile. Is that correct?
So we don't know for sure that she successfully gave birth. We just know that she was pregnant, presumably with her lover's child, and she was exiled probably when she was still pregnant, and that the child would have been ordered to have been exposed. So if she, you know, it's possible she had a miscarriage, never had the baby. It's, you know, equally possible that she did give birth and they would have exposed the child, which, yeah, I don't want to ruin anything in my own books, but I found that interesting as well.
And it's like wild to think of someone giving birth in exile like that, because they would have been separated from their normal support network.
Yeah, I mean, giving birth, especially for an upper class woman in ancient Rome, would have been like a pretty involved experience, I imagine. A lot of the birthing chair, a lot of people around to help, you know, as much as they can in ancient times. And I sort of went the route of she's bare bones in exile, so she has guards, and there would have been some slaves to keep everything running, but again, not the level of extravagance that she would have been used to in Rome.
What do we know about the conditions on Triremius and Julia the Younger's life in exile, and how would her situation have been different from that of her mom on Pandateria?
So archaeologically, there's no sort of remains that have been identified on the islands. And again, it's a group of four 4 or 5 islands. There's 2 larger ones. So a lot of the environment I created was based on the research I was able to do on other islands, which is typically there was some sort of developed port. And today, most of those ports are built over as modern ports, but you can see some of the ancient remains. And most of the islands as well had at least one villa, sometimes more. And so that's what I imagined for Julia as well, just based on my research for the other islands, is that it would have had some sort of decent villa, probably with a bath complex and a port for access. And then beyond that, just sort of went with my imagination. So.
I'm RJ Decker, a private investigator, uncovering the Sunshine State's darkest secrets.
Tuesdays, it's the premiere of ABC's hottest new crime show.
RJ freaking Decker, as I live and breathe.
He's a private eye.
It's not a standard murder, it's something bigger.
And a public mass.
Trying to get sent back to prison today?
You go to prison one time and suddenly it's all the jokes.
RJ Decker, series premiere, Tuesdays on ABC and stream on Hulu.
Greenlight helps kids learn about money by actually using it. It's a debit card and money app that teaches kids to earn, save, and spend in real life, not just swipe and hope for the best. Learning happens naturally, in the moment. Parents can set limits, see real-time spending, and guide better habits all in one place, without constant check-ins or cash runs. Don't wait. Try Greenlight risk-free today at greenlight.com/trygreenlight.
I actually wanted to talk a little bit more about those guards because, not to give anything away, but the relationship between Julia and her guards in your book it gets a little bit fraught. Like there's definitely a power imbalance there, and it makes me think of, correct me if I'm wrong, Jen, I think it was Agrippina the Elder who winds up dying in exile, and she was beaten so badly by a guard in exile that she lost an eye, I think. Is that right?
I think that's right, that she did lose an eye and was beaten so badly, but they're quite different. Agrippina the Elder was quite a different kettle of fish, shall we say.
Yeah, but I think that's kind of what I'm getting at with this guard situation, is that to me, it seems like it could be quite a dangerous situation. Like, obviously, in the beginning, the emperor, Augustus himself would not appreciate his daughters being mistreated, but he did send Julia the Younger into exile for the whole rest of her life. So there's also that. I don't know. What do you think?
I mean, as Augustus faded from power and the concerns over solidifying the next reign kind of emerged more, there is more violence in exile. It did very much start as a prison sentence, and then it very quickly shifts into just another way to get rid of people. Step 1, exile, get them out of Rome, send them to an island, get them away from the public eye, especially if they're someone who's popular and has supporters. And then step 2, anywhere from months to maybe a year or so later, is kill them. So as the empire continues on, you still do see exile in use, but it shifts into something that's much more just a precursor to execution, but away from Rome, which at the beginning, it was very much more of a sentence. It was a prison, but you weren't going to die necessarily. I feel like the guards were there to make sure that no one abducted you. There is historically a rescue attempt of Agrippa Posthumus, and then either Julia the Elder or Julia the Younger. The sources are a little bit confused about which Julia they were trying to save. And you do also see Agrippa Posthumus, I don't want to ruin too much, but Agrippa Posthumus, he doesn't make it, spoiler alert. There is an impersonator, though. So you see that there is a lot more violence, but you see, again, the importance of these people as figureheads. So in some ways, it made more sense just to kill them, because as long as they're in exile or people don't know if they're alive or dead, like, you could use them. If everyone knows they've been executed, it's just you're removing a chess piece from the board. So once Tiberius comes to power, you see a lot more violence, a lot more death. And that does continue even under Nero as well. He starts trialing people. But again, I largely feel it was just to remove people from the public eye in Rome, maybe hope that people forget about them and then get rid of them.
Yeah, like it becomes a lot more dangerous after Augustus dies. I think that's a good line to draw.
Once Augustus is gone, there was a movement with some people that we could go back to a republic. Like, yeah, Augustus was the anomaly, right? But the people who came afterwards, particularly those who wanted to keep an empire, keep power, Tiberius was not a very popular dude. People felt like there were other people in that line who would have been easier to manipulate or control. So, you had a lot of purges and there was a lot of murders happening. I remember when we did the research, when Caligula comes to power famously, like he burns the records of all the people who spoke out against Tiberius. He's going to be this new golden boy king. I mean, if you know your history, you know that didn't last. But there was this moment where it's like, oh, the horrors of this like horrible time we've had of all this plotting. It's over. We've got the son of Germanicus here. The family's had so much trauma. He's going to heal Rome. It doesn't quite work out that way. But you can imagine when the history tells us some of that stuff. And obviously a lot of it is embellished to give us a narrative. What it is telling us is people were exhausted and that power shifting and struggling was really terrifying for them.
Yeah, and that's definitely when you have to start worrying about the guards more, going back to the guards.
The guards, I think, disturb me the most about this whole situation. I'm just like, who are these creepy guards?
I mean, Sejanus, it's like the people closest to you when you have that kind of power are the ones giving you the illusion of that power and control. And that's one of the reasons, like, I'm just so fascinated with that story and with how the drama goes after Augustus dies and Tiberius takes control and everything that happens next. It's like, oh, but what happens when these people also have power, maybe more power than you do?
I do imagine most people listening to the podcast will like have an idea of what happens. So I'm just like, yes, they all die in 14. Like shit gets bad.
It gets real bad. And it's one of those things where that's where the soap opera turns and you've got like, who's Sejanus banging for power? Who's being exiled? Who's eating straw? Who's eating straw and is like their body is so like badly, like I'm thinking of Drusus. He's just so badly starved that they're like, I think we just have to kill him in quiet and not let anyone ever see what we did to this poor little dude,
He's like punished for what they did to him.
Yeah, but he's also just punished because of who he was and the fact that you could rally.
Who are some other famous Julio-Claudian island exiles, or exiles in general? What do we know about their lives in exile?
Yeah, so Ovid is exiled, and I have him as a character in my book. And he's not sent to an island. He's sent to Tomis, which is in modern-day Romania, so ancient Dacia. It's on the Black Sea. And he was sent to a specific location. He did not have the old-fashioned exile of, you just need to get out of Rome. He was specifically sent there to a very kind of remote place that he probably would have hated. I mean, for the time, I think Ovid was probably a little bit of a drama queen, which I try to play up a little bit in my book, like, him thinking it's worse than it is. But again, for someone who's very lively as a personality in Rome, used to all this extravagance, it would have felt very desolate and very terrible. He wrote a bunch in exile, which is very interesting to read. And he never makes it back. I don't think that that's a spoiler either. He is there until the end of his days, but I feel like he never stopped trying and hoping that he would come back. And so again, just looking at when he was exiled and what we know, which is not very much. There is a lot of scholarship and different thoughts on it, but we know it was a poem and an error of some sort. But again, based on the timing of around 8 CE when all this other stuff is happening, he was probably related to something else going on with Agrippa Posthumus, maybe with the younger Julia. It's just there's too much of a coincidence in the timing for him to have just been sent away at the same time approximately. And so I thought he would be a fun character to incorporate into the book in some capacity as well. Other exiles, you mentioned Agrippina the Elder winds up getting sent off. Nero Caesar gets sent to an island. Drusus Caesar is imprisoned in Rome, but also kind of sucked up into the whole violence and all of that. Agrippina the Younger is exiled at some point. Julia Livilla, who's another child of Agrippina the Elder, sent away. Claudia Octavia.
She's sent away twice. She gets exiled first when I think, it must be Tiberius's reign. She gets sent into exile. I'm not sure if it's with her sister or an island not far from Agrippina the Younger. And then she gets exiled again during, I think it's Nero's reign? Or no, or is it Claudius's reign?
Yeah, I think Nero Nero recalls her, I think, and then sends her away. It starts to kind of convoluted.
Yeah, and she's one of those ones you have to pull out of the history. But yeah, she gets exiled twice. I can't imagine what it would feel like to be exiled twice, to be like, I'm back, I'm safe. Oh no. I think the second time she's exiled is because of an affair with, I want to say Seneca, who was like 40 or 30 years her senior, but I could be wrong. I think it was a plot.
Yeah, and I think what's interesting as well is the same islands are generally used repeatedly for these women. We don't always know exactly which island they were sent to. Sometimes it's a little bit unclear on the historical record. There's just a note, oh, they were exiled to an island or to this group of islands, and you don't know for sure. But it's a small collection of islands that were used. Trimaris was used just for the younger Julia, at least in the Julio-Claudian period that I was looking at. But you also see Pandateria is used multiple times. Pontia is used multiple times, and then Polynesia, where Agrippa Posthumus was another one where he was just the only one there, if I remember correctly. So, but Pandateria was quite popular.
You wanted to keep them separate, right? Like you see a lot of the mothers and the daughters being exiled separately.
Yeah, there is a chance that, like you mentioned, Jen, that two of them, the sisters, were exiled together, but we don't know for sure. It's certainly possible.
And they were quite young. I don't even know if they were married at the time, or if they were, they would have been very like newly married. I think the oldest and the youngest of Agrippina's daughters, I think, were exiled together. Not Drusilla, because she was a whole other thing going on with that. But they might have been exiled together. I think probably they didn't have much power at the time, and putting them where they put them. Although I think that might have been after Agrippina had Nero. I'm not sure.
It's been a while since we did the research, so.
I have my dissertation here. I can like flip through, but I've been looking so much at like the younger Julia that I'm like, I haven't looked as much at their exile lately. So.
Yeah, it's one of those ones where I'm like, I can't remember if this is after. I think it might have been Caligula who exiled them after Drusilla's death, when he thought they were plotting with Lepidus. Yeah, and then they get called back. I don't remember why they get called back. Oh, Claudius must call them back. Claudius calls them back.
Yeah, I think I remember something about that. It was all about that power change, like who happens to be in power then.
And Claudius wanted that sort of like, yes, my brother's children are back. I am this great, magnanimous guy.
He wants to unify everybody.
What are you working on next?
I'm not really working on too much right now. I just had the second book in the duology come out at the end of September, so that's done now. And I would like to write more Roman historical fiction at some point. Unfortunately, I feel like it's not wildly popular at the moment. A lot of the historical fiction is still kind of stuck on World War II. But I'm hoping with Gladiator 2 coming out that there will be a resurgence. I also write romantic comedies. Tana Rebellis is my pen name, and then I write under my real name, Casey Morris, for the romantic comedies. And so I have a book that came out in February called Love and Chickens, which is sort of like an enemies to lovers set in the chicken show world.
That sounds hilarious.
Oh my God, this sounds incredible.
And I wrote it as sort of just like a writing exercise, because I'd written both of these books first, the historical fiction, and got my agent and everything, and that was like a whole long ordeal. And then, I just like needed a break and needed to like, I don't know, write something fun, because the historical fiction, it takes a lot longer because there is a lot of research and world building, and it's much more serious. So I just started writing this romantic comedy with show chickens, just like on a whim. And I self-published that as just like an experiment, and it did pretty well. So I guess the next thing I'm kind of working on is the second book in the poultry world, which the working title is Must Love Geese.
That's fun.
Yes. I'm so excited. I'm working on a smutty rom-com about wrestling.
Oh, I don't think I've seen any in the wrestling world. I know hockey. Hockey is very popular.
My other side is I also do historical sort of like fiction, romantasy kind of stuff. Myth retellings, mostly the Greek side. So I'm like, yeah, no, I know what you're saying. And that's what I got my agent with, was like, a Dionysus sort of retelling. So I feel you on the need to just like, maybe I just want to play with the chickens or the wrestlers or just something that's a little less serious.
Yeah, so I don't know. I might do that next just because I find it a little bit easier and quicker to write. But if I were to do something else in the Roman world, I don't know. I've been very fascinated by Agrippina the Younger. I like her in my second book, as you first meet her as a little girl, and then you meet her later as a young woman, and she's kind of vicious, and again, not a very likable character in the sense that she's, warm and fuzzy. Like she's like insane, like in a great way. And like, I just find that very intriguing, but I don't know. I worry that maybe she's been a little bit overdone.
Honestly, like men are allowed to do that. Like we're allowed to write male characters that are insane and vicious, like, and the bad guy, but also weirdly you root for them, or maybe you don't. Like, why can't, I think we should all have blanket permission to write our female characters as unlikable as we want.
I don't think I've read a great historical novel about Agrippina that I can think of. I've read great histories, but what I love about her, particularly looking at her as a kid, is she had such instability, and to get where she gets and to be exiled, to be the Empress of Rome and then the mother of the emperor, like she had to crawl over broken glass time and again and reinvent herself and play this game to such perfection. And even then it doesn't work out the way you'd want it to for her. And yeah, I love that she's like, there's a lot of stuff she does where it's deeply unlikable, but it's like, kill or be killed. And it just, I'm rooting for it. It's Game of Thrones with the Roman Empire.
Unlikability is so much more interesting.
Yeah.
Give me those villains. Or like, not even villains, but like normal people stuck in abnormal circumstances doing what they have to survive.
I mean, of course she's crazy. She watches her mother continually like shout out against the patriarchy. And
I don't know if she knew what the patriarchy was, or maybe she just knew too well. I don't want to paint her as like a modern feminist.
I don't think she was a modern feminist. I mean, there's nothing to say like Tiberius was the dude in charge and her mother was constantly shouting like, you killed my husband, you killed my husband. And what do you do when you see your mom do that and she winds up dead? Like, how do you then play the game so you don't wind up dead?
Yeah, I do think the ancient women who were from more powerful families and who were more educated, we can't call them feminists in today's sense. I do think it is a mistake, though, to say that like they were just happy with their lot in life, because if they were, like, you wouldn't see that these women were involved in rebellions and in plotting and in trying to have power. Like Livia is sort of like an OG in terms of developing her own power, but she knew how to do it as a woman in her sphere. But I think they were aware, unfortunately it was a man's world, but how do we work around that and work within that to advance our own interests and those of our children?
Exactly. Yeah, I totally agree.
Fulvia before her was playing that game as well, and it's always fascinating to see the ones in history who kind of get to live out their full lives. And Livia is one of them. And Livia touches on so much of that early empire because she is the stepmother and then the grandmother who several generations of children are raised by her under her tutelage. But there's also Octavia, who's a much quieter presence. And I always feel like, what was really going on behind the scenes in her house, in her mind? Like, what game was she playing? Because she lives. And again, she's always raising somebody else's kids. But she's also living a life that is never put in exile or anything else.
Have you guys watched Domina by any chance?
Yeah, we saw the first one. I think there's a second series of that we haven't watched, right, Jen?
No, we haven't seen the second series yet, but it's so good.
The season, I mean. Yeah, we actually watched it and covered it on our Patreon with a fellow podcaster, Kate the Exploress. It was really fun.
I don't think I watched the second series either, but we watched the first one. We really liked it.
You just think, like, what were these people doing? What was the magic sauce that kept you alive? And what didn't the historians tell us about what was happening in, like, the women's behind-the-scene rooms? I just think there's so much story to tell.
Yeah, I mean, that's what makes it so much fun for historical fiction is we have enough to know generally who they were and what they were doing. And then from there, it's just kind of, you get to create a story and hopefully do them justice.
Thank you so much, Tana, for coming on our show. This has been such a great time.
And Tana, where can people find you on the internet to find out more about your books and all that kind of stuff?
So my website is tanarebellis.com. Then I'm also on Instagram as Tana Rebellis. My books are available on Amazon, Barnes & Noble, generally pretty much anywhere you can buy books online, you can find them. So
awesome. Well, thank you again so much for coming on the show. This has been such a great convo. And thank you all for listening, and we will see you whenever we see you next.